Good afternoon and good morning, wherever you all might be. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the Global Alzheimer's Platform Foundation, and our Inclusive Research Initiative has organized this three-part webinar series on race and ethnicity data and clinical trials, which you are participating in today. At GAP, we are speeding the delivery of innovative therapies for those living with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and ensuring that clinical research is inclusive and representative of the disease population. In support of our mission, we are equipping the field with resources and information to make a difference in the fight to end Alzheimer's. For instance, through this webinar series, we're exploring the concepts of race and ethnicity and their role in health equity, which our first part was entitled Setting the Stage. Strategies for Data Collection was part 2, Getting Practical, and the FDA's guidance on diversity plans in clinical trials, part 3, guiding principles, which you are here joining us on today. So this is our last part of the series. We are wrapping with reactions to the FDA's diversity plans to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials guidance for industry. Now, before I turn it over to our fearless leader in the Inclusive Research Initiative, Dr. Tamiko MaGee-Rodgers, to introduce our dynamic panel, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping rules, if you will. So you are all welcome to turn on your cameras. It would be nice to see your lovely faces. Just as a reminder, you can change your view to speaker view versus gallery, so you can get a better view of the speakers if you desire. Please remain muted. If you would like to ask a question during that Q&A session that we'll have at the end, feel free to raise your hand, or if you feel more comfortable, you can enter questions in the chat box as I will be monitoring it. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Tamiko MaGee-Rodgers.
Thank you so much, Janae. I am so excited about today's webinar. I want to just say I appreciate all of your leadership and guidance with this webinar series. It's been great. Again, my name is Tamiko MaGee-Rodgers. I serve as the Associate Director of Recruitment and Strategic Initiatives with GAP. I am so excited, like I said, to introduce this panel today. First, we have Dr. Mickeal Key. Dr. Key is an acting consultant primarily for GAP's Inclusive Research Initiative team and other recruitment strategic needs. She's currently receiving training as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Kansas Alzheimer's Disease Research Center in neuroimaging and the design and implementation of lifestyle interventions to support healthy brain aging. She has a BS in psychology and a BS in biology from Louisiana State University, Shreveport, and an MS in experimental psychology from Indiana State University, and a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. Next, we have Dr. Patrick Ezeh. As a director and clinical trial diversity portfolio lead at Biogen, Dr. Ezeh brings over 20 years of clinical operations, technical, and leadership experience in pharmaceutical organizations of various sizes, as well as a global contract research organization. He has broad experience in research and development and the entire drug development value chain. He has a DVM from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and an MS in pharmacology from Tuskegee University, and a PhD in neuroscience from Auburn University. And next, we have Megan Gross. Megan Gross is the Associate Director of Clinical Site Services at AiCure. She has been working in clinical research for over 12 years, both in academic medicine and industry on studies in drug development and health outcomes across a variety of therapeutic areas. Her health outcomes work has largely been focused on underserved patient populations, especially those of low socioeconomic status and or of African American descent. Her education and training for research in both clinical trial design and biostatistics, as well as operational deployment. Additionally, she has been trained in medical clinical quality improvement and has a key interest in applying quality improvement methodologies to clinical research operations. Please help me welcome our esteemed panelists for today. So before we begin and jump into our questions, I have a few icebreaker questions. First, I will start with Dr. Mickeal. Can you please share your Alzheimer's disease story or connection? What inspires you in the work that you are doing, and what excites you in the right now in the field?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. MaGee-Rodgers, for that great introduction. And I'm happy to be with you all today. So I actually had a grandparent. So my paternal grandfather had a mix of dementia, Parkinson's, but he also is suffering from cancer. I did notice that the cancer was the more aggressive disease, so that's kind of what the doctors focused on. So I didn't really get any of that experience with the treatment of any of his symptoms with the dementia or Parkinson's portion. But that really got me interested in understanding the brain and how it works and what happens when it doesn't. And that's kind of guided, my academic experience and then, the experience that I've sought for working with GAP and other organizations. So yeah, I'm just excited about the momentum that the field is gaining, both on the drug side as well as the prevention side, because we know that this issue of dementia, Alzheimer's and related dementias is only going to get bigger, right, as our global population ages. So I'm excited for the momentum that the field is gaining and all the support that we're seeing in lots of different sectors. So
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Key. And you'll find too with GAP, there's a lot of people who have a personal mission or connection, right, to the work we do. So thank you so much for sharing that story. Okay. Next we have Megan. Can you tell me more about your role in patient engagement and retention efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see all of you, and I'm super excited to be here. So I'm work at AiCure, which is a global technology company that provides secure tools for remote patient engagement as well as data collection. Specifically, we leverage artificial intelligence for predictive medication adherence monitoring and digital biomarkers. So our technology was built over 12 years with diversity in mind, from race and ethnicity to unique challenges for patient populations, to even global scalability. And there's many engagement tools that we've built into our technology to support these retention efforts, specifically in those patient populations. From the participant perspective, um, the app really guides the participants into creating a daily habit per the protocol activities such as dosing, ePro, or digital biomarkers. We've even built in reminders for those activities and visits, micro reimbursements for each dose that's completed within the app. And there's also an ability for the patients to call the site right from the app. So, really trying to be one-stop shop. Additionally, we even provision smartphone devices equipped with cellular connectivity for patients who don't have a phone or reliable internet connection. Um, from the site perspective, as participants complete their activities in the app, then the data is populated on a site-facing dashboard, which is done in near real time. So that really enables sites to monitor the data, even reach out to the participant via video chat, call, or text as needed. And all of this data is used operationally as well. So we've demonstrated that medication adherence is predictive of early dropout and that adherence can be improved through intervention and support. So we have a team that monitors the adherence data to support the site with timely patient intervention, really highlighting those patients who are at risk and need more support. So it's a really holistic approach from many different angles.
Great. Thank you, Megan. I really appreciate all the great work you all are doing at AiCure as relates to patient engagement and retention efforts. So thank you so much for sharing. All right, Dr. Ezeh. In general, how does your work intersect with diversity initiatives in clinical trials?
Okay, thank you so much, Tamiko. So, as a clinical trial diversity portfolio lead, I'm responsible and accountable for leading a cross-functional group within Biogen for my assigned programs to develop what we call diversity action plan. And this diversity action plan is a document that you define, basically includes the information on your asset, includes information on the indication, and more importantly, it includes the section of the document that defines what are your diversity recruitment goals and what are the strategies that you are going to use to make sure that you deliver on those goals. So this diversity action plan is a cross-functional document. So multiple functional lines contribute to this document. It is also a living document that is data-driven. So as you go through the drug development chain, you can update it as necessary as you get more data from real-world evidence data or from whatever we have, other studies that we have run. Then you have to update that document to make sure that is supported by data, make sure that it's not something that you just out of the blue come up with, this is our target, and then this is how we are going to use it. So this document is something that we use both internally when we engage our governance, senior management. Is also a document that we're going to be using when we engage the FDA in fulfilling the current what is coming up as their guideline on ensuring that you have appropriate diversity and inclusion in your assets. So we make sure that the intended, all our studies that we are running include patients that should this drug make it to the market, it is inclusive of all the patients that are intended to be treated with that particular drug.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Ezeh. And that's a great segue to some of the background I wanted to provide you all about the FDA guidance that we're here to talk about today, right? So Congress passed a new requirement in the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act of 2022 that required drug and medical device manufacturers to submit diversity action plans to FDA ahead of pivotal clinical trials. So the law required FDA to publish draft guidance on the format and content of these diversity action plans by December 29th, 2023. So while this guidance is still underway, this panel will focus on the latest guidance from April 2022, which is diversity plans to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in clinical trial guidance for industry. So the FDA recommends a plan to enroll representative numbers of participants from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic populations be submitted to the investigational new drug or IND application for a drug, including biological products regulated as drugs, or the investigational device exemption or IDE application for a device. So the contents of the guidance document do not have the force and effect of law and are not meant to bind the public in any way, unless specifically incorporated into a contract. FDA guidance documents should be viewed only as recommendations, right? Unless specific regulatory or statutory requirements are cited. The use of should means that something is suggested or recommended, but not required. So the FDA, let me make sure. So while we look at that, the FDA has, come up with these requirements and suggestions, and just want to look at that. What are your thoughts on that as it relates to the FDA? And I'm looking just to understand what I just, shared. So the FDA suggests that sponsors may discuss their strategy to enroll a diverse study population at any time throughout the medical products development, right? It is encouraged for sponsors to submit the plan no later than when they are seeking feedback regarding the pivotal trial for the drug. So Mickeal, what are your thoughts on this? Is there a stage in the drug development process in which creating a diversity plan would be more critical?
Yes. So I'm going to reach all the way back to the preclinical stage
Okay.
because I think that there are aspects that affect health that we can model even in like the preclinical stage. So for example, I'm sure many of you have heard of like the exposome, right? So there are different aspects of our ecosystem, lifestyle, social and physical kind of environments that affect how a person develops a disease, how they may respond to possibly some type of intervention. And I think some of those things could be better modeled even at the preclinical stage. And I think if the idea that there could be differences is introduced even at that early stage, then it's already kind of built into the system, right? So by the time you do get to the clinical stage and you're testing with people, then it's less likely that it'll be an afterthought. It's less likely that there'll be kind of these things that we always talk about that should be considered are going to be considered earlier on. Again, there's lots of things I think that affect our health that can be modeled in this preclinical stage. So I feel like even clinical human trial is the best option for considering a plan.
Tamiko, I think you're on mute.
I think you're on mute, Tamiko.
Sorry about that. I was just talking away. No, I was just saying thank you so much. That was great. You said let's take a step back and look at the preclinical process first, right? Before we look at the actual clinical process. So that's great. So, Megan, I'm gonna, want to get your thoughts on this. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, what is the stage in the development process in which creating a diversity plan would be more critical?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with Mickeal that we can start this effort so early, even in that preclinical stage, thinking, operationally, and these specific to these guidelines, they're really focused on phase 3 studies specifically. And the purpose of those guidelines are really to ensure the safety and efficacy of new treatments for all. Um, but that testing on safety and efficacy starts well before phase 3, which the guidelines are testing, which is exactly what you're calling out. So there's certainly a benefit to ensuring diversity throughout all phases of drug development. And if we had to focus in on a specific area, I would say even more critically from phase 2 through 4, which is where those larger study populations are, intended to be representative of the patient population that will be prescribed the treatment post-dose. And those are really honing in on that safety and efficacy features there. So from a like operational perspective and post preclinical, that's where I would target.
That's great. Yes. Thank you so much for your feedback on that. Because you want to, look at all phases, right? Preclinical, and then, like you said, the post clinical side of things as well. So thank you so much for that. Dr. Ezeh, what are your thoughts on this? Is there a stage in the drug development process in which creating a diversity plan would be more critical?
Well, I think to add to what others have already said, my feeling is that the earlier the better. We know that later stage drug development, later phases 2, 3, and 4, are driven by the data collected during the phase 1 portion of the study. We also know that in most cases, you have normal healthy volunteers participating in that phase 1 studies. In many indications, that is where it starts. Now, we have both safety as well as pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic data that we collect in that phase 1 portion of this of a drug development. Those data drive the subsequent clinical development plans. So if you don't have a plan to make sure that early phase studies are all inclusive, then the data that you are using to plan for later stages may not be as accurate as it should be. So I feel that at minimum that there should be a plan starting from first in human. And as I pointed out earlier, this should be a living document. As you go along with in your drug development process, you can modify it. And even though you may not have to submit it to FDA at that stage, it prepares you to make sure that subsequent studies are fit for purpose, are reflective of the population the drug is intended to be available to those people that are afflicted with that particular indication. So I think at minimum from FIH, so that the data that you are using to plan for phases 2, 3, and 4 are reflective of the intended population for that particular asset.
No, that's great. Yes. And the common theme, it seems, right, is that preclinical first in human phase, right? To think before, right, we go on to the next phase and go to the post phases. So that's great, great feedback. Thank you so much. Now, as we go to our next question, it is suggested that sponsors define enrollment goals for underrepresented racial and ethnic participants as early as practical. What has been your experience in helping to shape these goals? I'll start with you, Dr. Key.
Yeah, so yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Biohermes first. And the fact that you know, we had the leadership, right? We have our great, you know, John Dwyer here on the call. And the idea was from the very beginning, like the very beginning. You're developing the protocol. You've already decided what your goal is going to be, right? And when you don't do that, it's almost like if you don't measure it, how can you change it, right? If you don't measure it, how can you move that needle? So when you make a decision that you're going to have a particular enrollment and you're not going to stop until you make it, that's how we're going to move the needle. And that's what we were able to do at Biohermes, right? Getting up to 24% underrepresented you know, populations in that study. I've been involved on the academic side and lifestyle clinical trials where that has also been the case, where it's like, hey, we have a goal and we're going to monitor it strictly and make adjustments as needed, whether that is additional advertisements, whether that's changing, you know, what you know, groups that you interact with. If you don't make that goal from the beginning, then it's really going to be hard to make those changes. So yeah, that's definitely the way to go, is not to do it at the end when you realize that you're kind of not meeting the mark, or you know, someone has to threaten your funding because you haven't met those requirements. If it's like a self kind of evaluated thing, then it happens much more organically and more authentically. So
Thank you, Dr. Key. And for those who don't know, Biohermes was GAP's first study or first sponsored trial, biomarker trial that took place April of 2021, and it was launched. And we had a goal of 20% from underrepresented populations. And as Dr. Key said, we've surpassed that goal, but that was a defined goal that we had. And I know John said we couldn't close the study unless we reached or surpassed that goal. So thank you for sharing that, Mickeal. Megan, so what has been your experience in helping to shape goals, you know, these goals for underrepresented racial and ethnic participants?
Yeah, well, certainly clinical trial design and the protocol design has a huge impact, and those goals, just like you're talking about, Mickeal. From an operational and technology perspective, we're really focused on ensuring that the configuration of our technology is patient-centric and easy to adapt. So once you get those patients in the clinical trial, that they'll be able to stay. And this can mean everything from the way that a questionnaire or instructions are worded within the app, to how we coach the patient to use the technology, to even the scalability across different geographic and environmental factors, such as access to a smartphone device or reliable internet. So we really work with sponsors every step of the way to customize the technology for their protocol and for their enrollment goals from initial concept, and then even through ongoing execution with active monitoring to help us ensure that we're meeting those goals and modify as we go if we need to.
Thank you, Megan, because that is important, like you said, monitoring right throughout that process, ensure if there's anything that needs to be changed, what's working, what's not working. But no, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Ezeh, so what has been your experience in helping to shape goals for underrepresented racial and ethnic participants?
Okay, so even before my current role as a portfolio lead in clinical trial diversity, as an organization, and prior to FDA coming up even with their guidelines on having representative from the underrepresented population in our clinical trials, Biogen as an organization has had goals and commitments to have that as part of their clinical development plan. So for every team moving the asset, you have to have goals and commitments included in your plan that we have to share with senior management. And in that plan, you have to have your targets, and then you have to have the steps or strategies that you have to follow to make sure that you meet those targets. And then these are goals that are monitored on an ongoing basis. So we have a dashboard that will be available to appropriate people, and they are monitoring it and making sure if you are tracking to goals, falling behind, or if you are ahead. So there are multiple efforts that are in place, and it requires different approaches. We have engaged communities that were intended to make sure that they are represented in our clinical trials. We also engage interest groups. So we have advisory boards. The advisory boards are not only scientific, but they also include lay people that have been afflicted with the disease, maybe family members, people that are treating those people afflicted with the disease, or people that those caregivers. So they give us information or give us input on, okay, this is something that is doable. And then, as others have pointed out, you make sure that you factor those in when you are designing your study to ensure that not only will you be able to recruit those underrepresented population, but you have to be able to retain them, because it doesn't do you a lot of good if you recruit them into the study and then they're not able to complete it. So we make sure that we engage different people. We make sure that we engage patients to give us input, potential patients to give us input, the investigators at the study sites to give us input on our study design. We also engage vendors. If we are dealing with hard to recruit population, we have some vendors that is their forte, that we engage them to help with identifying and referring patients to the sites that are participating in our clinical trials. So it's a multi-pronged approach that we take, but it starts with making sure that your protocol is something that you can operationally execute on and then meet those goals. Again, those goals have to be data-driven. You don't just come up with any goal. You have to convince management that based on data that is available, this is the appropriate goal, and this is a goal that is achievable.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Ezeh. And you highlight the importance of not only recruitment, but retention, right? Retaining that participant in your trial and what it takes to do that. So thank you so much for sharing that. So we go on to our next question. So for drug development, it is strongly encouraged that the collection of sufficient data from diverse populations inform analyses of drug exposure and response. We know that safety profiles may vary, right, due to genetics, for instance. So how have you seen this play out? in terms of data collection informing future drug development. And I'm going to start with Megan.
Okay, yeah. The literature as well as our scientific team has demonstrated that medication adherence rate of at least 80% is required in a clinical trial to detect a signal response. So if your study has less than 80% adherence, essentially you're comparing noise to noise. So this makes medication adherence really critical to clinical trials in terms of future drug development. In terms of data collection, we've also found that medication adherence is predictive. So, patients' adherence in their first 2 weeks of the study is predictive of their performance overall, and that adherence can be improved through intervention. So, this predictive nature of adherence can be leveraged operationally, either in study designs, such as a lead in period, or through active monitoring and intervention at the site level. And one of the largest factors to achieving and maintaining that high adherence rate throughout a clinical trial is good engagement between sites and participants to really support establishing a supportive environment for them. So our technology enables this, and that active monitoring calls the site to action to, have that continuous engagement with the participant.
Thank you so much. Yeah, patient engagement is so important, but I love how you also talk about medication adherence, right? Because we don't really talk about that as much as we should. But I admire all the work you all are doing at AiCure, and making sure that helping patients adhere to medication, especially when they're involved in the clinical trial. So thank you so much for sharing that, Megan. Dr. Ezeh. We know that safety profiles may vary due to genetics, right? For instance, how we have seen them play out. So in terms of data collection informing future drug development, how do you see this playing out?
Well, I think from experience, I think a lot of emphasis are just going into ensuring that we have diverse population, but we are talking about it in the context of patients when we have already reached the patient population. My feeling is that just as it is important to ensure that we have diverse patient population in the drug development chain, we also have to ensure that the normal healthy volunteers that we engage in clinical trials are diverse. We know, at least from experience, both on the sponsor and the CRO side, I know that most of the people that participate in normal healthy volunteer studies are people that are usually from lower socioeconomic environment. So these normal healthy volunteer studies are also usually located in urban areas. And then you draw from people in that environment. So I think when it comes to this data collection, we have to ensure that the data that we are collecting from the outset that will drive the subsequent ones, everything that we need to do to ensure that they are representative of the entire population for the intended population has to be addressed at that level. And again, it goes to the study design. If we know that there are certain genetic markers that we need to have for people that are going to participate, then we have to define it. And then we have to define it in the protocol. And then we also have to make sure that that is something that we can, the study sites can execute on to make sure that, again, the people that are participating in the trials are people that are intended for the drug to treat, should that drug go to the market. So it's something that, again, throughout the phases of drug development, we need to make sure that the data that we are collecting are data that will be as generalizable as possible. Not only when we reach phase 3, because at that point in time, we're using the previous data to plan what we are doing in that phase 3. And if that data that we're using is not accurate representation of the population, then we are shortchanging some sector of the population that drug will be very useful to. And as a sponsor, you are also shortchanging yourself because, again, you are not giving wide array of people to benefit from your drug, which a lot of time and effort had gone into. So I think, again, we start from the beginning because the data from the beginning drives, again, what you are doing down the line.
And that's so helpful, especially just to have your perspective as a sponsor, right? In the importance of the study design, right, and the protocol. So thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Ezeh. And Dr. Key, how do you see this play out, right, in terms of data collection informing future drug development?
Yeah, thank you. Like my esteemed colleagues, though I have not had as much experience on the drug development side. I can talk about adverse events in lifestyle clinical trials just in the same way that the other panelists have talked about, those adverse events then informing like how you move forward in future kind of trials. But if we're sticking with the drug development side, I think what I can say is what we're hearing is that inclusivity and diversity in clinical trials is just good science, right? Because without that, just kind of reiterating some of the things that Dr. Ezeh said, then you're not creating a drug that works for all people. You're essentially excluding people that could benefit from a intervention, from a drug. And that's bad science, right? So diversity and inclusion in clinical research is just good science. And that's kind of what we're seeing.
I love that, Dr. Key. Let's all remember that, right? Diversity in clinical trials is good science, right? So thank you so much for sharing that. Our next question. So the FDA suggests that when there are data that indicate that the medical product may perform differently across the population based on race or ethnicity, the plan should specify the study design features that will support safety and effectiveness. How do you think this further supports the importance of representative clinical trials? And I'll start with you, Dr. Ezeh.
Okay, I mean, when FDA uses the word "we suggest," my experience is that you better do it. If you want your drug, if you are lucky enough to reach the point where you are submitting your NDA or your BLA, you better have that data. Because when they say, we suggest that you do X, Y, Z, is another way of saying if you want to make sure that your drug is going to be approved at the end of the day, this is the kind of data that we need, that will be necessary for us to make an informed decision to support that your application. So it is imperative that, again, you generate the data that can be generalized across the entire population that is intended to be treated with that drug. If you make it narrow, even if you get your approval, well, FDA may restrict the population that drug can be prescribed for, and then you're shortchanging yourself. So you want to make sure that you are collecting enough data that you can generalize across all the different subgroups. If there are differences in efficacy or differences in safety, you should be able, or it is very, very vital that you have that kind of data, because again, sometimes there may be situations where even when a drug is approved, there may be some conditions for some populations in terms of be it the dose, be it the frequency of administration, and different things that can make it specific to certain ethnic groups. So again, I think they are suggesting, but I take it as we want you to do this if you want to ensure that the data that you submit to us will be complete, and then your likelihood of getting approval will increase if you do this.
That's great. That's valuable feedback. Yes, that word suggests means you should do it, right? Thank you, Dr. Ezeh. Dr. Key, so the plan said, FDA says the plan should specify the study design features, support safety and effectiveness. How do you think this further supports the importance of representative clinical trials?
Yeah, so again, I don't have extensive, background on the drug side, but I feel like this question kind of opens up the idea of being more expansive when we think about diversity and inclusion, because there are existing kind of cases right now with drugs. So if you take like hypertensive drugs, right, for example, there were specific, so in this question we're talking about race and ethnicity, right? So general practitioners have been given um race specific suggestions on how to prescribe hypertensive medications, right? So we know there's a breadth of different types of hypertensive medications that one can get, and kind of the guidance is that there's a more narrow kind of prescription for, say, African American individuals that present with hypertension versus non-Black participants. So, and what I think the research is starting to show is that that guidance actually is not helpful. And that it actually could prevent people from getting the type of medication that they need to control this, your blood pressure, which affects all kind of other things because vascular issues kind of kick off lots of other kind of chronic conditions, right? And so they're starting to understand that even though originally I think that guidance did come from a clinical trial, specifically like only honing in on race and ethnicity, um, narrowed that guidance too much. And so the suggestion was that we should be looking at other factors, like how many drugs that an individual is on, what does the follow-up care kind of look like, what are the lifestyle and dietary factors that can also affect how a drug works with an individual, um, you know, things of that nature. So thinking of diversity and inclusion wider than just race and ethnicity. There may be other like behavior patterns or other kind of factors um, that should be included in this. So I'll kind of leave my comments there in being more expansive about how we think about diversity and inclusion. If we're talking about, we're thinking a drug works differently in different populations.
Thank you, Dr. Key. And we can apply that to Alzheimer's disease research, right? When we're looking at that, right? And looking at those different factors and not just basing it on race and ethnicity, but looking at those other factors too that you just stated. So thank you so much, for that. And Megan, how do you think this further supports the importance of representative clinical trials?
Yeah, so the FDA suggesting this really underscores the criticality of a diversity action plan, right? So, clinical trials are intended to determine safety and efficacy of a drug for all patients. And just as we've all been saying, this testing should be generalizable to the real world population. And we can't generalize those results unless the trial is not inclusive. So, I really agree with my co-panelists here, and I just think that their suggestion, not really a suggestion, just like our other panelists are saying, but also it just it really underscores that criticality of this, and I hope that this will really push our industry into that right direction.
Great, thank you so much. I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I want to just sneak one more question in before we get to questions. And I'll just leave it up to the panel, whoever wants to respond. So the FDA advises that in some cases, increased greater than proportional enrollment of certain populations may be needed to determine important differences. Is this a possible solution to design trials specific to underrepresented populations to ensure that market drugs work for everyone? So I'll leave it to you all.
All
I
right.
mean, I can, oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll take one for the team.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead and I'll follow you.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we definitely should be designing clinical trials in an inclusive way with underrepresented patient populations in mind, and really ensuring that it's feasible for those patients to complete those protocol requirements. And the scalability and adaptability of that design is really critical to the success of that underserved population. So I think this remote technology can certainly support this, with potential to even reduce the need for in-person visits, having those ongoing engagement tools, and supporting these patients through what are now really complex clinical trial designs. But I also think feasibility has a really big impact to the success of a clinical trial as well. And while we're looking to change the patient population that participates in a clinical trial that reflects this underserved population, we may also need to enroll new sites that have access to new patients who traditionally don't participate in clinical trials. So the success of that study design is also dependent on operational site training, coaching, guidance. And again, just going to highlight active monitoring can even support these initiatives at scale. And, I think all of that falls into play with the success of those underrepresented populations.
You raise great points. Thank you, Megan. Dr. Key?
That's good. Yeah, I like that. I like that, Megan.
Mhm.
I like this suggestion. I'm not sure if it's practical, because people are still struggling with getting, um, you know, a proportion of individuals who represent like the national average, right? So to get above and beyond that, I'm not sure. I'm sure we'll get there at some point, but right now, if we're talking about practical, if we're talking about how we're going to get people on board, um, I would love to see more, especially in the Alzheimer's field, looking at individuals with Down syndrome, right? I think that's a population that this type of trial design could work well for, because we know that the etiology of the disease, right, is quite different than the majority population. It's really like heavily genetic based, right, because of the that amyloid precursor protein being on the 21st chromosome and they having 3 copies of that. So I think in that context, a specific, population focused type of trial would be great, because right now, that hasn't been done. And I think the question is still out there, how safe are these drugs for that population, where if you're over 60 and you have Down syndrome, that's like 50% of those individuals over 60 with Down syndrome have Alzheimer's. So I think in groups like that, this is a great approach to increasing our understanding of how it works in different populations.
Thank you, Dr. Key, for raising our awareness, right, of Alzheimer's disease and Down syndrome individuals. Did you want to?
Yeah, so yeah, my answer to this, yes and no. I think it depends on the situation, as Dr. Key just pointed out. I think in some cases, a small targeted study may be the right way to go. It may be a viable option, more viable option versus having a very large protocol that will take you forever to execute on. So we also know that in many cases, we have post-approval commitments that FDA requires of sponsors. you get a drug approved, but they look at it, the data that the demographics of the data that you collected the data from, and they see that, okay, we want a certain ethnic racial population or different or pediatric population that they were not included in the study that you conducted. And they will say, okay, we want to, as a post-approval commitment, conduct a study in a defined population to give us the data, to give us more confidence that this is going to work in that population as well. So I think in some cases, that is the best way to go. But there are other situations where that, again, may not be necessary, again, depending on the number of patients that are available for that in that particular indication. So it's a yes or no answer in my opinion, and every situation has to be approached the best way possible that the sponsor thinks will give them the best chance to generate enough data from all the intended population.
Thank you, Dr. Ezeh. That's great. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Dr.
I think,
Yeah.
and this is just to emphasize one of the first questions, right? Like, if you have a plan ahead of time, this is a straightforward, like power calculation on how many, if you want to do a subgroup analysis, how many people do you need in each group to be able to detect a difference? So if you don't plan at the beginning on how many people that you need in each group, then you're not going to be able to detect those differences. And that's why sometimes we don't see it, because often those subgroup analyses are done post hoc, before they've actually done the work of making sure they have the numbers that they need to see it, an actual statistical significantly difference, right? So I think I'll just throw that in there too.
No, that's great. No, that's why it's important to have a plan, right? And then, like we said, continuing monitoring that plan throughout the whole process. So, no, that's great. Thank you all. That was so awesome to hear from everyone. And I I know we only have like, I think 6 minutes for questions, but I just wanted to open it up. If anyone had any questions for our panelists, you can put it in the chat and we can make sure we ask them your question. But again, we thank you so much for joining us today. This is a great discussion. I know we could continue to talk about this forever, right? But we're just happy that you all were able to join us today. But any questions?
So Tamiko, I have one.
Okay. John?
And it's driven by something that happened this morning when Dr. Procaccio of the FDA was on the LEAD call. For those of you who know LEAD, most of you should. And she was going through the guidance with respect to Alzheimer's trials for stage 1, 2, or 3 participants. And she actually said, and I don't want to misquote her, but she clearly said that when it came to diverse populations and the issue of how we're seeing really different screen fail rates with the beta amyloid PET or with the blood markers, she, sort of tapped the third rail and said, maybe we have to reevaluate the cutoffs. Well, it's easy to say, it's a whole lot more difficult to implement. Moving the goalposts is never a terrific way to conduct research, but GAP is clearly concerned about it without advocating for a change. So I'd love your distinguished panel, especially those that live in Kansas, to opine on that. But we like people from Chicago and Boston as well. So we're eager to have you folks give us your point of view from your various perches.
Okay, Dr. Ezeh, like to go
Yeah,
first?
well, I think if FDA is the one suggesting it, again, the question is if I think every sponsor wants to make sure that their study is run efficiently, on time, on budget. They collect the necessary data that they can defend before the agency. Now, if they want to, my feeling is that if they want to give guidelines on how best to design Alzheimer's trial, they should come up with that so that sponsors have something to stand on when they design their study, and then collect the data and then go before the agency if they are fortunate enough to go to that stage and be able to defend that data. So this may be something that she's thinking aloud about, but if it's something that the agency is seriously considering, I think they should share that broadly so that, again, sponsors can have that in mind to make sure that their study design is fit for purpose and it's something that they can defend and stand on when the time comes.
Thank you, Dr. Ezeh. Dr. Key, Megan, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I think generally when we have high screen failure rates, my thought immediately goes to medication adherence in a pharmaceutical clinical trial or drug development. So I think it'd be really important to understand the medication adherence within that population. Often in Alzheimer's patients, it's pretty low. We're seeing like 40 to 60% in clinical practice. So if you're in a drug trial and you're looking for specific outcomes, and the patient is not adherent, it's really challenging to rely on that data when they may not actually be taking the drug. So I think incorporating that within the study design, either in a lead-in period, to help ensure that you are enrolling patients who can maintain that adherence and have that compliance demonstration, would be a good first step. And then, evaluating your screen failure rate based off of that inclusion exclusion criteria after you have that adherence.
Thank you, Megan. I know we have a minute. Dr. Key, did you want to?
Okay, it's not enough. I'm still thinking about this too, John. I'm still thinking about this too. This makes me think of eligibility criteria, right? And how that probably needs to be more expansive than it is. And if we're not creating different thresholds, then maybe maybe we're expanding our eligibility criteria, and the scientist in me is like, maybe there's a reason why we should be kind of going back to the drawing board about, like, is this the best marker we should be using for criteria in for this drug, right? So that's my 2 cents, is expanding eligibility criteria. If we're seeing the screen failing, then expanding it and looking at other factors that are predictive of someone being successful in a trial.
Well, I want to take a second and thank this panel. This has been terrific, and I know Tamiko will wrap it up, but really important, timely. We're going to hear more about this from now to June 10th, I think. So this is just the start, not the last word. And as a word I don't often use, it was awesome.
John. Well, thank you, John. And thank you to our esteemed panelists today. And we thank everyone for joining us. And we will keep you all informed of future webinars that we host, both from GAP and from our, as it relates to, you know, DEI. And please let us know if there's a topic you're interested in learning more about. We welcome your feedback. So thank you all, and hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye. Thank you so much. Thank you.